The rain started at 11:23 p.m. on a Thursday in October. By 11:47 p.m., it had become the kind of storm that makes people check their windows twice before going to bed, the kind that floods gutters and turns suburban streets into shallow rivers. The temperature had dropped to 47 degrees, and the wind was pushing the rain sideways, turning it into something closer to a weapon than weather. In the Ballantine Country Club area of Charlotte, North Carolina, where the houses cost more than most people earn in a decade, and the lawns are maintained by services that charge monthly fees higher than apartment rents, a woman stood on a front porch in silk pajamas. She was barefoot, she was soaked, and she was completely still. Her name was Marielle Winters. She was 38 years old, and her husband of nearly 4 years had just locked her out of the house. Through the glass storm door, she could see him standing in the foyer. Derek Winters, 42, was wearing the expression of a man who believed he had finally won something. His mother, Patricia, stood behind him in a bathrobe, her arms crossed, her face arranged into something between satisfaction and contempt. Derek's mouth was moving. He was saying something through the glass, but Marielle wasn't really listening anymore. She had heard variations of these words before, words about respect, words about his house, words about what she was and wasn't worth. Tonight, the specific phrases included declarations about how this was his property, how she contributed nothing, how she should be grateful he had tolerated her this long. Marielle didn't bang on the door. She didn't plead. She didn't cry. She simply stood there, rain streaming down her face, her silk pajamas clinging to her body, and watched her husband perform his victory through the glass. When Derek reached over and turned off the porch light, leaving her in darkness, she didn't flinch. She simply lowered herself to the top step and sat down. Across the street, in a house with warm lights glowing behind plantation shutters, a woman named Claudette Morrison watched this scene unfold. She was 55 years old, a retired school principal, and she had lived in this neighborhood for 12 years. She had seen the Winters couple move in. She had watched the wife become quieter over time, had noticed how she seemed to shrink whenever her husband was around. Claudette had never said anything because people don't say things in neighborhoods like this. But tonight, watching a woman sit in the rain in her pajamas while her husband stood safely inside, Claudette picked up her phone and dialed 911. The police arrived in 12 minutes. 2 officers stepped out of the cruiser. Tanya Webb, a 34-year-old black woman with 8 years on the force, and Marcus Hall, 29, her partner of 2 years. They found Marielle exactly where she had been sitting, still motionless, rain still falling. Her lips had taken on a slightly blue tint. She was shivering, though she seemed unaware of it. Officer Webb approached her first, speaking in that careful tone police use when they're not sure what kind of situation they've walked into. She asked if Marielle was hurt. She asked if she needed medical attention. Marielle responded to each question with the same calm, measured voice. No, she wasn't hurt. No, she didn't need an ambulance. Yes, she understood she could press charges for domestic disturbance. No, she didn't wish to do so at this time. When the officers knocked on the front door, Derek opened it with a smile that had been hastily assembled. He was charming now, all concern and confusion. He explained that there had been a misunderstanding, a small argument that had gotten out of hand. His wife, he said, had a tendency toward dramatics. She had chosen to go outside. No one had forced her. Patricia appeared behind him, nodding along. The woman was unstable, she offered, always seeking attention. They had been dealing with this behavior for years. Officer Webb listened to all of this with a neutral expression. Then she turned back to Marielle and asked if she needed emergency shelter or assistance finding a safe place to stay for the night. Marielle declined both offers. She asked only one thing. if she could retrieve her shoes and purse from inside the house. Derek hesitated. For a moment something flickered across his face, a calculation about what it would look like if he refused. Then he stepped aside and allowed her entry under police supervision. Marielle walked into her own home, like a guest. She moved past the living room she had decorated, past the kitchen where she had cooked thousands of meals, past the photographs of a marriage that had been a performance for at least 3 of its 4 years. She went upstairs to the master bedroom where Patricia watched her with undisguised hostility. From the closet she retrieved a pair of simple black flats. From her nightstand drawer she removed a manila folder that had been waiting there for 8 months. From the dresser she picked up her purse. She walked back downstairs, thanked the officers for their time, and stepped back out into the rain. She stood on the sidewalk, opened her phone, and requested an Uber. The car arrived in 7 minutes. She got in without looking back at the house, without acknowledging Derek and Patricia, who stood watching from the window. The car pulled away, its taillights disappearing into the storm, and Marielle Winters was gone. Officer Webb and Officer Hall returned to their cruiser. Neither said anything for a long moment. Then Hall spoke, his voice thoughtful in the way of someone trying to work out a puzzle. "Something about that woman," he said. "Something about the way she moved, the way she spoke. She didn't seem like someone who had just been humiliated. She seemed like someone who was waiting." Webb nodded slowly. She had noticed it too. The calm that wasn't shock. The composure that wasn't defeat. The way Marielle had taken that manila folder from her nightstand, like it was the only thing in the house that mattered. "Something was coming," Webb said. She didn't know what, but something was definitely coming. She was right. To understand what happened next, you need to understand who Marielle Winters actually was, not who Derek believed her to be, not who his mother had dismissed her as, but who she had been before she ever met him. Marielle Elise Beaumont was born in Atlanta, Georgia, the only child of Charles Beaumont, Jr. and his wife, Vivian. The Beaumont name meant nothing to most people, which was precisely how the family preferred it. Charles Beaumont Sr., Marielle's grandfather, had been one of the first black investment bankers on Wall Street in 1962. He had started with nothing and built something that would outlast him by generations. Beaumont Capital Holdings, a private equity firm that, by the time of his death in 1998, managed over $400 million in assets. Charles Jr. took the firm further. He expanded into real estate, healthcare, and minority business lending at a time when black-owned businesses were being systematically denied capital by traditional banks. He was quiet about his success, almost pathologically so. The family had learned, across 3 generations, that visible black wealth attracted a particular kind of scrutiny, a particular kind of danger. So they stayed quiet, they stayed private, they let their money work without announcing its presence. When Charles Jr. died of a heart attack 5 years before this story begins, his daughter Marielle inherited everything. The firm, which had grown to manage $2.3 billion in assets, the real estate portfolio spanning 14 states, the minority stake in a professional sports franchise, the controlling interests in a regional hospital chain, and 2 commercial development companies. All of it passed to a woman who had spent 6 years at Goldman Sachs, who held degrees from both Spelman and Wharton, and who had been groomed since childhood to carry the family legacy forward. But Marielle was tired. She had watched her parents' marriage strain under the weight of money and expectation. She had watched her father work himself into an early grave. She had spent her 20s and early 30s proving herself in boardrooms, where she was often the only black woman present, and sometimes the only woman at all. When her father died, something in her shifted. She didn't want to prove anything anymore. She wanted to be seen for who she was, not what she owned. So she made a decision that her cousin Jerome whom she installed as CEO of Beaumont Capital, called either brilliant or insane depending on the day. She stepped back. She moved from New York to Charlotte, a city where no one knew the Beaumont name. She attended board meetings virtually, camera off, under a pseudonym. She let the firm run under Jerome's capable leadership, while she collected her share of the profits in accounts no one knew existed. And she went looking for something she had never had, a normal life. She met Derek Winters at a charity gala 14 months before their wedding. She had attended anonymously, her donation made in cash under a different name, her dress deliberately understated. Derek was a regional sales manager for a medical device company, handsome and charming in that way that successful salesmen often are. He told her he was looking for a woman who wanted to build a home, not a career. He told her he believed in traditional values and a husband who provided and a wife who nurtured. He told her he was tired of ambitious women who cared more about their jobs than their families. Marielle heard all of this and made a decision she would later struggle to explain even to herself. She told Derek that she worked in consulting. She told him she had some family money, enough to be comfortable. Both statements were technically true in the way that saying the ocean contains some water is technically true. She wanted to see if a man could love her without knowing what she was worth. She wanted to believe that such a thing was possible. They dated for 14 months. Derek proposed with a ring he had financed over 24 payments. Marielle said yes, and for a brief moment she believed she had found what she was looking for. The warning signs were there from the beginning, but Marielle had chosen not to see them. When Derek insisted their house be purchased in his name only, citing tax advantages that didn't actually exist, she agreed and quietly paid the $180,000 down payment from an account he would never see. When he made small comments about how refreshing it was that she wasn't one of those aggressive career women, she told herself he was old-fashioned in a charming way. When he began making household decisions without consulting her, she told herself this was what compromise looked like. The first year of marriage was a slow erosion. Derek controlled the finances, the social calendar, the television remote. He spoke over her at dinner parties. He corrected her in front of friends. He had opinions about her clothes, her hair, her weight, her cooking, and he shared these opinions freely and frequently. Marielle absorbed it all with a patience that she told herself was grace, but was actually something closer to research. She was learning who her husband really was. She was documenting the education. The second year brought Patricia. Derek's mother lost her apartment lease under circumstances that were never fully explained, and she moved into the guest room for what was supposed to be 2 weeks. She never left. Patricia Winters was 67 years old and had raised her son to believe he was exceptional. She had also raised him to believe that women existed to serve that exceptionalism. She looked at Marielle and saw a woman who had somehow captured her son without deserving him. A woman who did not cook well enough, clean thoroughly enough, or express sufficient gratitude for the privilege of being Derek's wife. The criticism was constant and surgical. Patricia would rearrange Marielle's belongings without asking. She would throw away items she deemed unnecessary. She would make comments at family dinners about Derek's previous girlfriends, how successful they had become, how much better suited they had been. Derek never defended his wife. When Marielle raised concerns privately, he told her she was being sensitive, that his mother was from a different generation, that she needed to show respect for her elders. The third year brought financial abuse dressed up as fiscal responsibility. Derek demanded access to all of Marielle's accounts, citing transparency and trust. She created a decoy account with $50,000 and gave him the login information. It was enough to seem substantial, but not enough to reveal the truth. Derek never questioned it. He never imagined there might be more because he had already decided what his wife was worth, and it wasn't much. He began monitoring her spending with the intensity of an auditor. Every purchase required justification. Every dollar had to be accounted for. Meanwhile, Derek bought himself a new Audi, a country club membership, watches that cost more than some people's monthly rent. When Marielle asked about these expenses, she was told that a man's spending was different, that he was investing in relationships and appearances that would benefit them both. She was given a monthly allowance of $400 and made to understand that this was generosity. The fourth year, the year that ended with Marielle standing in the rain, brought public humiliation. Derek no longer bothered to hide his contempt. At his company's Christmas party, he introduced her to colleagues as his little housewife, who didn't do much but looked pretty enough. At family gatherings, he criticized her weight in front of his sister Vanessa, who laughed along and offered diet advice. Patricia told neighbors that Marielle was lucky Derek had taken her in, that she had no real family of her own, that without Derek she would have nothing. None of them knew about the manila folder in Marielle's nightstand. None of them knew about the private investigator she had hired 18 months into her marriage, the one who had documented Derek's affair with his 28-year-old assistant, Keisha Dawson. None of them knew about the forensic accountant who had traced Derek's hidden credit cards, his secret debts, his expense report fraud at work. None of them knew about the hidden cameras Marielle had installed in her own home, the ones that had captured Patricia stealing jewelry and cash, totaling $3,400. And absolutely none of them knew that the house they lived in sat on land owned by the Beaumont Family Trust, that Derek's mortgage was held by a bank in which Marielle held a controlling stake, or that his entire career depended on a hospital chain that she owned and could remove from his client list with a single phone call. Marielle had spent 4 years being called worthless. She had spent those same 4 years building a case file that would end everything Derek thought he had. The morning after the lockout, Derek Winters woke up feeling victorious. He had finally done it, finally taken a stand, finally shown his wife who was in charge. He called his mother and sister over for breakfast to celebrate. They sat in the kitchen, eating eggs that Patricia had made, discussing what would happen next. Their assumptions were unanimous. Marielle had nowhere to go. She had no money of her own beyond whatever Derek chose to give her. She would spend a night or two at some cheap hotel, realize her situation, and come crawling back. When she did, they agreed, there would need to be new rules. More respect, more gratitude. Perhaps she would need to apologize publicly to Patricia for all the trouble she had caused. Derek texted Marielle that afternoon. The message was brief and condescending. When she was ready to apologize and come home, he wrote they could discuss terms, but she would need to show him respect going forward. He expected a response within hours. He did not receive one. That same day, Derek called a divorce attorney. His reasoning was strategic. If Marielle didn't come back immediately, he wanted to be prepared. He wanted to protect his assets. The attorney asked about his wife's income and assets, and Derek laughed. She had none, he said. She hadn't worked in years. She had some small family money, maybe $50,000 in savings, but nothing significant. The attorney assured him that in a situation like this, with such clear financial disparity, Derek would be well protected. He might even be entitled to a portion of whatever modest assets she had. Patricia, meanwhile, began her own campaign. She called friends from her church to share the news of her troubled daughter-in-law. The woman was mentally unstable, Patricia explained. She had run out into the rain in her pajamas for attention, had called the police herself to create drama. It was sad, really. Patricia had tried so hard to help her, but some people simply couldn't be helped. Vanessa took to social media. She posted a vague but pointed message about women who didn't appreciate good husbands, about the importance of gratitude, about how some people didn't understand how good they had it. Her followers, who knew nothing of the actual situation, responded with supportive comments about ungrateful wives and the decline of traditional values. None of them thought to wonder where Marielle had actually gone. None of them considered that a woman who had been systematically demeaned for 4 years might have been making plans of her own. Marielle was at the Ballantine Hotel, 3 miles from the house she had paid for but never owned. Her room was a suite charged to a corporate account that appeared in no documents Derek had ever seen. She had taken a hot shower, changed into clothes she had purchased with a card he didn't know existed, and slept for 10 hours straight. When she woke, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. She felt clear. Her first call was to Harrison Cole III, a 62-year-old attorney whose firm had represented the Beaumont family for 3 decades. Harrison had been waiting for this call. He had met Marielle several times over the years, had gently suggested that her marriage might benefit from certain legal protections. She had declined then. She was not declining now. Her second call was to Jerome, her cousin. She told him it was time to become visible again. She told him she would be attending the next board meeting in person. She told him she needed certain information about certain clients, and she needed it documented in a way that could be presented in legal proceedings. Her third call was to the forensic accountant who had been quietly tracking Derek's finances for 2 years. She asked for a final report, complete and comprehensive. She asked for it within 72 hours. And then Marielle did something that Derek, in all his calculations, had never anticipated. She did nothing. She didn't call him back. She didn't respond to his texts, which grew increasingly frustrated, then angry, then threatening. She didn't post on social media. She didn't reach out to mutual friends. She simply vanished into a silence so complete that it began to feel to those waiting for her to break like something ominous. A week passed. Derek's confidence began to curdle into something else. His texts to Marielle shifted from demanding to confused to, eventually, something that approached concern, though not for her well-being. He was concerned because her silence didn't make sense. People who had been locked out in the rain didn't just disappear. They came back. They made scenes. They did something. On day 10, Derek made a decision that he believed was strategic. He filed for divorce. His attorney had advised him that filing first could provide certain advantages, particularly when it came to establishing a narrative. Derek filed with a petition that described Marielle as an unemployed housewife with no significant assets, a woman who had been supported entirely by her husband's income, a woman who had abandoned the marital home and refused to communicate. He requested the house, both cars, and spousal support from whatever modest resources she might have hidden. His attorney sent Marielle a settlement offer through Harrison Cole's office. It was brief and insulting: $15,000 and 60 days to collect any personal belongings from the house. Take it or leave it. Harrison Cole read the offer in his corner office with a view of downtown Charlotte. He set it down on his desk and looked at Marielle, who sat across from him with the same preternatural calm she had displayed on the night of the lockout. He asked her if she was ready. She said she was. The mediation was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in late November. It took place in a conference room on the 14th floor of a building that housed several of Charlotte's most prominent law firms. Derek arrived with his attorney, a man named Paul Whitfield, who specialized in representing husbands in contentious divorces. Whitfield was competent and experienced, but he was operating on information that had been incomplete from the start. Marielle arrived with Harrison Cole and 2 associates. She was dressed simply but expensively, in a way that Derek had never seen. There was something different about her carriage, something that made Whitfield pause momentarily as she entered the room. He shook off the feeling. She was a housewife with no income. His client had assured him of this repeatedly. The first hour of mediation proceeded along expected lines. Whitfield presented Derek's position, which was essentially that Derek deserved everything because he had provided everything. Harrison listened patiently, taking occasional notes, asking occasional clarifying questions. Marielle said nothing. She simply sat with her hands folded, watching her husband with an expression that revealed nothing. Then Harrison Cole opened his briefcase. The first document he placed on the table was a land deed. It showed that the property on which Derek's house sat had been purchased in 2019 by the Beaumont Family Trust. Derek's mortgage, Harrison explained calmly, was essentially a lease payment. The house itself, the structure that Derek had claimed as his own for nearly 4 years, had never been his to claim. Derek's face went pale. Whitfield reached for the document, studied it, and asked for a moment to confer with his client. Harrison continued as if he hadn't heard. The second document was a bank statement showing a wire transfer of $180,000 from an account in Marielle's name to the title company that had processed the home purchase. This was the down payment, Harrison noted. Derek had contributed exactly nothing to the equity in the home. The third document was a photograph. It showed Derek and a young woman at a restaurant, their hands intertwined across the table. The photograph was dated, and it was from 14 months ago. The next photograph was from a hotel parking lot, also dated. The next was from what appeared to be a weekend trip to Asheville. Harrison laid them out methodically, one after another, a timeline of betrayal documented with the precision of a legal exhibit. North Carolina, Harrison observed, was one of the few states where adultery could still affect divorce proceedings, particularly regarding alimony. His client, he said, would be pursuing all available remedies. The fourth document was a credit report. It showed 3 credit cards in Derek's name that did not appear in any of the financial disclosures he had provided. The total balance across these cards was $89,000. Under North Carolina law, debt concealed from a spouse during marriage proceedings constituted fraud. It also became the sole responsibility of the spouse who had concealed it. Derek found his voice for the first time. This was a setup, he said. His wife had lied to him, had pretended to be something she wasn't. He had been deceived. Harrison Cole's response was delivered without inflection. He noted that his client had never made any false statements to her husband. She had told him she worked in consulting. She did, in fact, consult for several companies in which she held ownership stakes. She had told him she had family money. This was, if anything, an understatement. At no point had she lied. She had simply allowed her husband to make assumptions and had not corrected them. There was no law against allowing people to reveal who they truly were when they believed they held all the power. The final document Harrison produced was a letter on corporate letterhead. It was addressed to Derek's employer, a medical device company that derived 43% of its regional revenue from contracts with a hospital chain called Southeast Regional Health Partners. The letter, signed by the CEO of Southeast Regional Health Partners, indicated that a comprehensive vendor review would be conducted over the coming quarter. Given recent concerns about billing irregularities and expense report discrepancies associated with the account manager Derek Winters, the partnership would need to be evaluated. Southeast Regional Health Partners, Harrison noted, was wholly owned by Beaumont Capital Holdings. Marielle Beaumont Winters held a controlling interest. Derek stared at his wife across the table. She met his gaze without expression. She had not spoken a single word since the mediation began. The silence stretched for a long moment. Then Whitfield quietly asked if he could have an hour to confer with his client. The mediation resumed that afternoon with a substantially different tone. Derek's position had collapsed entirely. The house was not his. The down payment had come from his wife. His affair had been documented. His hidden debts had been exposed. His job was, at best, in serious jeopardy. Whitfield, to his credit, was professional about it. He acknowledged that his client's initial filing had been based on incomplete information. He proposed a settlement that was, essentially, a complete surrender. Derek would vacate the house within 30 days. He would receive no portion of his wife's assets. He would be responsible for his own debts. The divorce would be granted on grounds of adultery, which would become a matter of public record. There was one more matter, Harrison noted. The hidden cameras in the home had captured footage of Patricia Winters removing items from Marielle's jewelry box and dresser drawers. The total value of the items taken was $3,400. Formal theft charges could be filed, or Mrs. Winters could sign a confession, acknowledging the theft and waive any further claims against the family. That evening, Patricia Winters sat in her son's living room and signed a document admitting that she had stolen from her daughter-in-law. Her hands shook as she wrote her name. Marielle was not present for the signing. She had never requested an apology, never demanded satisfaction, never asked for anything except the documentation of what had been done to her. The aftermath unfolded with the slow inevitability of a natural process. Derek's employer, faced with the prospect of losing their largest regional client, launched an internal investigation. What they found extended beyond the concerns raised in the letter. Derek had been falsifying expense reports for 3 years, inflating client entertainment costs, and pocketing the difference. The total amount was not large, perhaps $12,000 over 3 years, but it was enough. He was terminated for cause. No severance, no unemployment benefits, no reference letter for future employment. Keisha Dawson, the woman Derek had been seeing, learned about his circumstances through mutual friends. She stopped returning his calls. She had been attracted to a successful sales manager with a nice house and confident swagger. A divorced, unemployed man living with his mother offered a substantially different proposition. Patricia Winters found that her social circles had contracted dramatically. Word had spread through channels that these things always spread through. The church friends she had told about her troubled daughter-in-law had heard other versions of the story now. They had heard about the lockout in the rain, about the theft, about the divorce proceedings. Patricia was quietly removed from the Women's Ministry Leadership Committee. She was not invited to the Christmas charity planning meetings. She was, in the parlance of such communities, no longer someone whose calls were returned promptly. Vanessa Price, Derek's sister, experienced her own reckoning. Someone had compiled screenshots of her social media posts from the weeks following the lockout, the ones praising good husbands and criticizing ungrateful wives. These screenshots found their way into wider circulation alongside the actual facts of the case. The juxtaposition was not flattering. Vanessa's husband, a quiet man who had always seemed slightly bewildered by his wife's family, began asking questions about her judgment that he had never asked before. Derek moved into his mother's one-bedroom apartment in a development 30 miles from the house he had once claimed as his own. He spent his days sending out resumes that generated no responses. The medical device industry was small enough that word had spread. He was, at 42, essentially unhireable in his field. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, Marielle Beaumont appeared on the cover of Black Enterprise magazine. The headline identified her as one of the 20 most powerful women in private equity. The article detailed her family's history, her educational background, her quiet but substantial role in directing billions of dollars toward minority-owned businesses and underserved communities. There was a photograph of her standing in the lobby of Beaumont Capital's New York headquarters, composed and elegant in a way that would have been unrecognizable to anyone who had known her as Derek Winters' wife. She had purchased a new home in the Myers Park neighborhood of Charlotte, in her own name, with her own money, answerable to no one. She had established a foundation providing financial literacy education and emergency assistance to survivors of economic abuse. She had returned to the work she had been born to do, the work she had set aside in pursuit of something that had never really existed. One afternoon, a few weeks after the magazine article appeared, Claudette Morrison checked her mailbox and found an envelope with no return address. Inside was a handwritten note on simple cream stationery. The note thanked Claudette for the phone call she had made on a rainy night in October. It thanked her for seeing something that others had chosen not to see. It thanked her for believing that a woman sitting alone in the rain deserved someone to notice. Enclosed with the note was a check for $50,000, made out to a youth mentoring organization that Claudette had founded 15 years ago and funded mostly out of her own retirement savings. The memo line read simply, "For those who see." Claudette stood in her driveway for a long moment, holding the check, remembering the woman she had watched that night. She had seemed so still, Claudette thought, so patient, like someone who knew something that no one else in that scene could possibly have understood. Officer Tanya Webb received a promotion to detective 6 months after the Winters case. At her promotion ceremony, she was surprised to receive a community service award from an organization she had never heard of. The nomination had been submitted anonymously. The citation praised her professionalism and compassion in responding to domestic disturbance calls, her ability to see past surface circumstances to the human beings involved. Webb thought about that rainy night sometimes, about the woman who had sat so calmly on the porch steps, who had asked for her shoes and a folder and nothing else, who had disappeared into an Uber without a word. She thought about the look in that woman's eyes, the one that hadn't been defeat or desperation, the one that had looked, in retrospect, like certainty. There is a particular kind of power that comes from patience. It is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It simply waits, accumulating evidence and opportunity, until the moment when waiting is no longer necessary. Marielle Beaumont had waited 4 years. She had watched her husband reveal himself in small cruelties and large ones. She had watched his mother and sister participate in her diminishment with enthusiasm and without remorse. She had documented everything, not out of vengeance, but out of clarity. She had wanted to know with absolute certainty who these people truly were, and they had shown her thoroughly and completely, because they believed she would never be in a position to do anything about it. They had been wrong about that. They had been wrong about many things, but Marielle had never corrected them. She had simply allowed the truth to accumulate until it became undeniable, until it could be laid out on a conference table in neat stacks of paper, until it could speak for itself, without requiring her to raise her voice or shed a tear. Derek Winters lost everything he thought he owned. But the truth was more precise than that. He never owned it in the first place. He had simply been allowed to believe he did for a time, by a woman who needed to understand what her belief in him had cost her. The cost, in the end, was 4 years. 4 years of silence. 4 years of observation. 4 years of learning exactly how much cruelty people were capable of when they believed they were safe. It was an expensive education, but Marielle had always been a good student. On the last night she spent in Charlotte before her life changed completely, Marielle Winters stood at the window of her hotel room and watched the rain fall over the city. It was gentler than it had been that night in October, a soft autumn rain rather than a driving storm, but it still made her remember the cold, the wet silk clinging to her skin, the way Derek had looked at her through the glass, so certain of his power, so confident that he had finally broken her. He had not broken her. He had clarified her. He had shown her exactly who she was and exactly who he wasn't. In the end, That was almost worth the years she had given him. Almost. She turned away from the window and began to pack. There was work to do, real work, the kind that mattered. There were companies to invest in, communities to support, legacies to build. There was a life waiting for her that was larger than any house, any marriage, any man who thought he could measure her worth by what he chose to see. Marielle Beaumont had spent 4 years being underestimated. She would not spend another moment explaining herself to anyone who hadn't earned the right to understand. The rain continued to fall over Charlotte, over the house that was no longer Derek's, over the neighborhood where Claudette Morrison was sleeping peacefully, over a city that had never known what moved through it, quietly, patiently, waiting for the moment when waiting would no longer be required. Some justice arrives with sirens and spectacle. Some justice files paperwork and waits for signatures. Some justice simply removes itself from situations that were never worthy of its presence and allows the consequences to unfold naturally, logically, with the cold precision of math. Marielle Beaumont understood all of these forms. She had learned them across 4 years and 1,000 small humiliations, and one night standing in the rain. Now she was done learning. Now she was ready to teach. But that is another story for another time. This one ends here, in the quiet, with a woman packing her bags in a hotel room, with rain falling softly outside, with the knowledge that patience is not weakness and silence is not surrender. Sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is wait. And when the waiting is over, when the truth has been documented and the evidence has been gathered, and the moment has finally arrived, sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is simply walk away. Marielle Beaumont walked away. She walked toward a life that was entirely her own, built on foundations that no one could take from her, answerable to no one's expectations but her own. Derek Winters had locked her out in the rain. She had locked him out of everything else.